Hello. In this review, I will tell you the history of the development of the South Korean main battle tank K-1. Today, the subsequent version of this tank, the K-2 Black Panther, ranks among the top 5 tanks in the world. I'll tell you more about both the K-1 and K-2 in future reviews. But today, let's dive into the history of how the Little Abrams, as this tank is often called, came to be and why South Korea decided to invest in developing such tank instead of purchasing well-known and battle-tested ones. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click like. It helps us create better content. Let's burn. The South Korean tank in its base version is a third-generation tank, modeled after the American M1 Abrams, but adapted to South Korean conditions. It was made smaller and more compact, earning the nickname Little Abrams or Baby Abrams. Moreover, during its development, the South Korean company received significant assistance from the American company Chrysler Defense, which at that time was working on the Abrams tank and contributed many of its designs, as well as prototypes. If you look at the prototype of the South Korean tank, named XK-1 following the American convention, you'll notice a striking resemblance to the American XM-1 prototype. I mentioned this in my review of the Abrams tank, but it's worth noting again. In 1982, General Dynamics Land Systems acquired Chrysler's tank development division. For those who haven't seen my review of the Abrams tank's development history and capabilities, link will be in the description. Let's now dive into the history of the K-1 tank's development. The story of the South Korean tank began back in the 1970s. As you probably know, South Korea's neighbor is North Korea, which was heavily equipped with Soviet tanks. By the mid-1970s, it's estimated that North Korea had around 1,500 T-55 and T-62 tanks in service. But this wasn't the only driving factor. The Vietnam War also played a role, specifically the so-called Nixon Doctrine, announced in 1969 in response to the colossal losses and expenses the United States endured during the war. According to this doctrine, the U.S. pledged to continue supporting the defense of its allies while reserving the right to determine the scale, form, and scope of its involvement in regional conflicts based on its national interests. In June 1969, the withdrawal of 550,000 American soldiers began, which was completed by March 1973. Under the same doctrine, in 1971, 20,000 American soldiers were withdrawn from South Korea, and the U.S. scaled back its military commitments to the country. This reduction in American presence, North Korea's military buildup with Soviet support, and the weakening of security guarantees from its main ally pushed South Korea to take action. First, they increased defense spending to boost domestic production. Second, they began designing new weaponry, not just tanks but also firearms. Today, South Korea is recognized for its excellent military equipment, tanks, self-propelled howitzers, machine guns, and more. But the origins of this reputation trace back to that very period. Yes, South Korea had American M48 Patton tanks of various versions and M60 tanks as well. At that time, many countries were using them. European nations were actively replacing them with newer models, and South Korea had similar aspirations. Initially, the idea was to modernize the existing tanks, but budget constraints posed a significant challenge. The country didn't have the funds to rearm its entire army with new guns or make radical improvements. Although upgraded versions with larger caliber guns were introduced in limited numbers, it wasn't enough to meet their needs. In 1976, South Korea's Ministry of Defense launched a project to explore ways to improve existing tanks and potentially develop a new, indigenous tank. However, producing tanks under license or designing their own was a monumental challenge for the country. Past attempts at such efforts had been met with failure, and even licensed production faced numerous difficulties. Consequently, the decision had previously been made to purchase ready-made tanks, as it was simpler and more affordable for the country at the time. Starting in 1976, the focus shifted to upgrading the American M48 Patton tanks. One of the objectives was to replace the 90mm gun with a 105mm gun, upgrade the engine, and provide better targeting systems where possible, essentially squeezing as much performance as they could out of the existing platform. At that time, these upgrades were handled by Hyundai Precision Engineering, a company now known as Hyundai Rotem. As part of the same project, South Korea approached the US with a request to produce M60 tanks under license. The South Koreans couldn't afford to purchase the license and instead asked for it as a gift. Their plan was to produce approximately 130 M60 tanks between 1979 and 1981, fostering closer cooperation with the U.S. Starting in 1980, South Korea hoped to embark on joint development of a completely new South Korean tank. The U.S., however, declined the request, reasoning that North Korea was relatively subdued at the time, the perceived threat had diminished, and there was no apparent need for South Korea to have so many tanks. But this wasn't the only rejection South Korea faced. The country also approached Germany, which at the time was developing another well-known tank, the Leopard 2. While it hadn't yet been adopted for service during the period in question, the prototype had already been presented. South Korea proposed collaborating with Germany to develop a tank, using the Leopard 1 as the foundation rather than the Leopard 2, and adapting it to South Korean conditions. However, the Germans also declined. The reasons weren't hard to find. South Korea was not a NATO country, North Korea posed a geopolitical risk, and Germany wasn't keen on sharing its advanced technology. Pragmatic as ever, the Germans always find solid grounds for a refusal. This is when the US, which had only recently denied South Korea's request, stepped back into the picture. The US has a somewhat famous unwritten doctrine: they'll make the right decision after trying all other options first. As ironic or cynical as it may sound, history in the 20th century provides countless examples of this. In 1978, the US agreed to sign a contract with Chrysler Defense, now General Dynamics Land Systems, for the joint development of a tank based on the M1 Abrams prototype. While they weren't willing to provide tanks directly, they essentially said, "Here's the company designing them, they'll share their ideas." This marked the true beginning of the K1 tank's history. The design phase began in 1980, and in an impressively short time, by 1981, Chrysler Defense and Hyundai Precision Engineering presented a project for a new tank based on the Abrams. As mentioned earlier, the first South Korean tank prototype bore a strong resemblance to the American one. Several factors needed to be addressed during the development process, including the terrain and the physical characteristics of South Korean tank crews. South Korea has a mountainous landscape, narrow roads, and small bridges. The original Abrams tank, being heavy and wide, would have struggled to navigate such terrain, climb hills, or cross bridges, especially if multiple tanks were traveling together, potentially causing the bridges to collapse. This necessitated reducing the tank's size and weight. South Korean soldiers were generally shorter than their American counterparts, meaning less internal space was required. This allowed designers to lower the tank's height. For perspective, the K1 is approximately 190 mm shorter than the M1 Abrams and 230 mm shorter than the Leopard 2. Interestingly, over the 40 years since the K1 was adopted, the average height of South Koreans has increased by about 9 centimeters. This has created a problem. Many tank operators now struggle to fit comfortably inside the tank, and those who do often find it difficult to perform their duties effectively. As a result, some aspiring tank operators are disqualified simply because of their height. This issue illustrates how societal changes can affect military equipment, underscoring the need for adaptability in defense design. Let's return to 1981. For the reasons mentioned earlier, the K1 earned the nickname Little Abrams. Beyond its smaller size, modifications included a redesigned turret profile, a different engine, reduced weight, and lighter armor. A crucial difference lay in the design philosophy. While the US developed the M1 Abrams to fight anywhere against any adversary, with an emphasis on crew survivability even after a direct hit, South Korea's K1 was tailored for the specific challenge of facing North Korea. The focus was on mobility and maneuverability rather than heavy armor to withstand direct hits from high-caliber rounds. South Korea's main concern was the T-62 and T-55 tanks of North Korea. The assumption was that the K1's armor would withstand hits from those tanks, while its agility on narrow roads and hilly terrain would allow it to evade direct confrontation. Chrysler Defense understood these priorities, which enabled a relatively quick design process. Simplifying and reducing an existing design is inherently easier than adding features or making it more complex. The M1 Abrams was equipped with the 120 mm smoothbore M256 gun, but the K1 received a 105 mm rifled KM68A1 gun. This choice wasn't merely a technological compromise. The reduced size of the K1's turret couldn't accommodate a 120 mm gun. The first prototype, PV-1, was built to test mobility and the engine's performance. It featured the Teledyne Continental AVCR-1790 engine with 1,200 horsepower. Instead of a functional turret, a mock-up was installed to test the overall turret shape and integration. PV-1 was sent to the US for trials in collaboration with the US Army. The tests demonstrated good mobility, and the project was recommended to proceed to the next stage, focusing on turret functionality and firepower testing. The PV-2 was closer to the final design, featuring a functional turret with a fire control system, operational gun, and other combat-ready components. The same American engine was retained, but adjustments were made to the chassis to integrate these updates. This prototype also underwent testing in the US. However, trials revealed several issues with the suspension system and firepower capabilities. These challenges led to a decision to replace the American engine with a German MTU-MB 871 Ka501 engine. While PV-2 was being tested in the US, South Korea produced 5 more prototypes for domestic testing. These iterative designs incorporated lessons learned during the trials, leading to significant refinements. The German engine replaced the American one for better reliability and performance. A new fire control system was installed. The hull was redesigned to accommodate the new engine. Ammunition storage locations and configurations were altered to improve safety and efficiency, differing significantly from the Abrams. By 1985, the K-1 had undergone enough refinement to enter mass production. The design process, though rapid compared to other tanks of the era, delivered a vehicle tailored to South Korea's unique operational needs. The result was a tank that, while inspired by the Abrams, was optimized for South Korea's terrain, infrastructure, and combat requirements. By 1987, 210 K-1 tanks had been produced and delivered to the South Korean Army, marking the year the tank was officially adopted. As you can calculate, only 5 years passed from the start of the design process to serial production, a remarkably short time for tank development, especially considering the sophistication of its successor, the K-2 Black Panther. The K-1 offered an excellent balance of cost and quality for its time. The K-1 tank is officially designated as the K-1, but other names like K-188 or Type 88 are also used informally. The 88 in these names references the 1988 Seoul Olympics, held a year after the tank's adoption. However, this unofficial naming has caused some confusion due to the existence of the Chinese Type 88 tank, which is entirely unrelated. In 1985, the production of the basic version of the K-1 tank began, and by 1987, it was delivered to the South Korean Army. The production of this version continued until 1998. In 1996, the next version of the tank, the K-1A1, was introduced. This version was heavier and featured a redesigned turret to accommodate the 120mm smoothbore KM-256 gun, the same model used on the Abrams but manufactured under license in South Korea. Serial production of the K-1A1 began in 1999 and continued until 2010. The tank was officially adopted into service in 2000. A total of slightly fewer than 500 units of the K-1A1 were produced. By 2010, the South Korean Army had approximately 1,500 units of both the K-1 and K-1A1 tanks in service. In 2013, South Korea introduced the K-1A2, an upgraded version of the K-1A1. It retained the 120mm gun but featured several improvements in fire control systems, mobility, and overall combat effectiveness. This progression highlights South Korea's ability to evolve its armored capabilities over time, transitioning from reliance on foreign designs to producing world-class tanks tailored to its unique operational needs. The K-1E1 version was introduced in 2014. Initially, this designation referred to the K-1A1 version, but when the larger caliber gun was added, it was renamed the K-1A1. The K-1E1 retains the 105mm gun but includes several other improvements. K-1E2 is expected to appear in 2024. K-1A3 is projected for 2027. Since 2014, serial production of the second version of the tank, the K-2 Black Panther, began. As for the first version, since the start of production, 1,027 units of the K-1 and K-1E1 versions were produced. Approximately 500 units of the K-1A1 and K-1A2 versions were made. To date, over 1,500 K-1 tanks are in service with the South Korean Army. The South Korean Army has active orders, and when production under the latest agreement is complete, there will be approximately 500 K-2 tanks in service. International demand for the K2 is high, with several ongoing export orders. As for the prices, the basic version of the K1 costs around $2.5 million per unit. The K1A2 version is priced at around $5.5 million per unit. The K2 Black Panther is estimated to cost between $7.5 million to $8.5 million per unit. More details about the K1 and its modifications, as well as the K2, will be covered in future reviews. Well, that was the history of the creation of the South Korean K1 tank. I hope this video was interesting and informative for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click like. That's all from now. Wishing you peaceful skies. Bye.